I've had several students in the class ask if I can re-explain the concept of a feminist literary study. So I'm going to do my best to pull it into two parts. One, before you can examine anything from a feminist perspective, you have to understand what it is. And second, the part where you take a theory and apply it to understand a specific part of society or the reason behind something, but how we also use that in literature. So, in addition to posting this video, I'm also going to be posting all the links that I use within this video. So, I'm going to use this slideshow that I had started with when we started reading Touching Bottom before we actually read through the story. So you can actually reference some of these slides within that. One of the key things that you need to know about feminism is the idea that women were denied the same rights as men in society. And that created an inequality between them. What we see down below is that in many of the studies of the fight for women's rights, there was three key waves as to what women were fighting for. The very first one was because women were actually, according to the law, considered property. They were property of their father, then they were property of their husband, and in being property, they had no rights in which to say anything about what was going on in society. So women did not have the right to vote. And they most certainly did not have a place in government in which to make those decisions. So there's many historical moments for Heritage Canada that has these suffragists, is what they're called, who are fighting for the ability for women to be seen as their own person, number one, and not as property, and number two, when I am a person in Canada specifically, that I am able to vote. So that was one of the first inequalities that women found in society, and that they fought for the right to vote. The second form of inequality that they identified was a woman's role, whether it be in the household or in the workplace. In 1945 was the end of World War II, and women in particular had been in the factories and in the workforce as the men were off to war. When the men came back, they went back into the household and they became responsible for the household and all of the chores that they had always assumed. And so now women realized that they wanted to go into the workforce. Now, there had been women in the workforce, but traditionally they had only been teachers or nurses. And in fact, really only the wealthy were entitled to education and higher education. So if you wanted to become something more than a high school diploma would allow you to, during the 50s and 60s, women actually were not allowed in most universities, including Canadian universities. And so women realized that if they wanted a job in the workforce, if they wanted to pursue careers that needed higher education, they were fighting for the ability to attend higher education and to be able to have access to those rights. Now, what they were fighting for was a key part here, is that they identified that there were barriers to them pursuing education, higher education, and even if they attained that education, because institutions were allowing women in the 60s and 70s, specifically more towards the 70s, that women, when they graduated, were not finding jobs because there was still barriers to hiring women. And so in the 60s, 70s, that's when that was the focus of the inequality, and that women were fighting for workforce entitlement so that they could demonstrate that they could be a part of the workforce. So now we have the third wave of feminism is that while women have become people in society and women have fought for the right to education and to be able to be in the workforce, and that it is against the human criminal code of human rights and privileges within Canada that you cannot be denied a job because you are a woman. This is where the third wave comes in, is that in many ways, shape, and forms, there are barriers to women being able to do certain jobs, whether it be rising to the top of the hierarchy in a business, or whether it be simply the ability to get into the job that you're looking at. And then also the inequality that exists within workplaces. So one of the interesting things that can be seen in today's version of the waves of feminism is I actually read a really great article about how women were, and still continue to be impacted by COVID. More women have exited the workforce to take care of their families than men. And what we're looking at is the idea that women still assume the majority of the household chores and childcare responsibilities, and that positions for men in their employment are often seen as more important. Now, am I saying that women can't continue to work and take care of their families? Absolutely not. But what we still find is that women in today's society are still taking on the lower paid jobs or minimum wage jobs. They make up the largest demographic who are assuming those responsibilities and those jobs in particular. And so if it was to come down between a man and a woman choosing to stay home, typically you would go with the one that has the more flexible schedule, position, or lowest amount of pay, so that you still have someone earning a significant amount in order to pay all the bills. So we're looking at how the past has influenced today's perspective about women and women's roles in society. In Google Classroom, I will have posted this video. You won't be able to hear the sound through this video, but I would highly encourage you to watch it starting at about 3:40 into the video. So I'm just going to talk through the majority. The key idea here is that feminism is the study of inequality, and it is not necessarily just that they are only fighting for women's rights. They are looking at gender studies and the idea of rights and equality for everyone. So there is also a perspective of looking at individuals in society who faced a marginalized perspective where they may not have the same equity in seeking jobs or positions in society. So we're looking for support for social equality among genders. And what this theory does is you would set it up against a study where you would look at maybe in particular the workforce, where we would be looking at where does inequality exist? And that's what we're looking for within this perspective. So if we were to look at it from another sociological perspective, that same idea of the workplace, we might look at it from a functionalist perspective and say that there's other issues. When you change the perspective or the lens that you're looking at it, you identify specific issues that you're paying attention to. And I want you to think about that when we come upon literature analysis, because that's where we're going with this. So in this video, it does a few definitions, and it also explains the idea of feminism. The waves of feminism start at 3:40 as well. And it also, in the beginning, gives a little bit of background as to the early sociologists who were women and how they themselves faced inequality in their studies, whatever it may be. So we are looking for inequality. That's one of the concepts that we want to look for. The other one that we're looking for is patriarchy. These are some of the key concepts, and I'll go through what those are and what we're looking for within the story. Patriarchy is a social organization whereby institutional structures are dominated by men. Institutional structures can include the government, the workforce, religion, school. It can be a number of things. And so when we look at patriarchy, we often see that in positions of power and those who have decision making, often in our society, the highest positions typically, not all the time, but typically are held by men. And so if you want to look at it, since I've been at PECI, I have only had one female principal. Why is that? Where are the positions that women are in, and the ones who have the most ability to make decisions, where are they and what position do they hold? You can look to your government. If you were to look at your government body, if you were to look at federal, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau worked very, very hard in which to make it about a 50-50 ratio. He increased the rate of women included in politics and taking seats in the House of Commons and in Parliament. He increased it something from like 10% to 50% from one government to the next to have a representation of women within those positions. So that's what we're looking at, is the idea of representation of women, and we're looking at the inequality that might be created by positions of power that are held typically by men who might not know or might not have women's best interests in mind. So when we look at feminist theory and we're studying the impact on society, where women have an unequal position in society, here are some of the key things that we're examining when we examine society from a feminist perspective. This comes from Owl Purdue, and I will link this into the classroom. These are the concepts that you would hold when you're looking at an issue in society from a feminist perspective. That women are oppressed by patriarchy. In every domain where patriarchy is, women are typically marginalized. In Western Anglo-European civilization, it's deeply rooted in patriarchy. And so typically they go back to the Bible, where Adam and Eve are the driving preface of how women should be handled. So this is why women weren't allowed to be anything but property, because according to Adam and Eve, it was Eve who committed the original sin, and so women were viewed as less than, men in particular, and so men typically hold the power in that dynamic. Culture determines our gender, the scales of masculine and feminine, and what we deem as okay for masculine and feminine. I watched an interesting TED Talk one time about how and why most of the helper robot voices are women's voices or feminine voices. So Siri or Alexa, they also contain women's names. And the reason for this is that we often see women in a subservient role in which they are to service or provide for someone. And so we're looking at the idea of when you say someone is female or male, what the roles or expectations are for them within that given culture, because that can change from culture to culture. Here's a key one. When we look at items in society and even literature from a feminist perspective, its goal is to change the world or to demonstrate gender equality or to represent the inequality and how you can reach for equality, and that they play a part in every part of human production and experience. So when we look at issues or literature from a feminist perspective, these are 4 key terms that are really important to be able to evaluate what are some of the key issues within that particular situation. gender, oppression, inequality, and patriarchy. These will guide your literary analysis.